My name is Paul Navarre. For those of you I may not have met before, um, thank you very much for being here. Um, so if you can mute yourselves, just so we don't get extraneous noises, that would be lovely. But feel free to unmute and ask me any questions you have as we go along here. So this is a 4-week class. We've done 2 already. We have today and next week left. If you miss any, you can go to standrewlutheran.com, click on the education menu and then adult education, and these are being recorded and they are uploaded there, so you can catch any that you may miss at our website.
They do it there.
So last time we were kind of talking about different architectural styles of churches. I'm a big fan of the Gothic style, so I wanted to give a couple examples of that. And this is perhaps the most famous Gothic church of them all, Notre Dame in Paris. It is certainly one of the ones that a lot of churches across Europe were styled after. Many of the innovations, the architectural innovations that were used in the building of this were copied in other places. It's probably not the first true Gothic church, but it is very, very important in terms of a model for other churches. Let's see here, and I'm kind of shuffling my notes a little bit. Notre Dame, one of the things that's really nice about Notre Dame is its location. The little cross there is where it's located on the island there in the middle of Paris. Off on the left side, you see kind of an angled green rectangle. That's where the Eiffel Tower is. From Notre Dame, you can walk to the Louvre. It's just a couple blocks away. The Latin Quarter is just a little southeast, so it's right in the heart of everything with the water around it. Just a wonderful, wonderful setting there. Of course, any self-respecting cathedral of the Middle Ages and earlier has its relics, and that is the crown of thorns. The organ, you can see a little bit of the vaulted ceiling there behind it. That organ is 15th century. It's been rebuilt, but that's where its origins are from. So you can get a sense of the Gothic vaulting, how narrow it is, but then how tall it is. And that was what they were really going for, was increasing that height and allowing for more light to come in by having more windows. It was started in about 1160. So it's kind of considered early Gothic, built over about 2 centuries. It's 420 feet long. So, you know, a football field from end zone to end zone is about 300 feet. So that gives you some sense of the incredible length of it. The width of the nave, kind of from pillar to pillar, is just 39 feet. So 420 feet long, 39 feet wide. It is very, very narrow. It's about 115 feet from floor to ceiling. And so there's like 2 architectural features that I really want to look at just a little bit. One of them are these incredible rose stained glass windows. You can see the detail on there. You know, it leaves an incredible impression when you're in there because of the colored light shining through. One of the things that's a little bit too bad when you visit is that you can't see the detail that well because you can't get that close. So you kind of have to rely on pictures to see what's actually there. Now, in terms of the age, a lot of the glass has been repaired over the years. One of them is quite modern, relatively speaking. One still has a lot of middle-aged glass in it. And if you're wondering, these pretty well survive the fire. They need to do a little bit of cleanup, but when Notre Dame is restored, it will be at its past glory without much of a doubt. This is the west side, and you can back up and see it a little bit behind the organ. And that's what it looks like from the outside. Now, when we think of Gothic architecture, you think of a Gothic arch. That's not a Gothic arch. That's just a regular arch, Roman arch. It kind of makes sense because what they're trying to, you know, cover is a round window. But it does cause some structural trade-offs. If you back up a little bit, you can see that they could do that because there's nothing over it. There's very little weight on top of that. So that allowed them to use that type of arch without having incredible stresses pushing outward. And they still have really beefy pillars there. But that allows them to do that. You'll see that there are Gothic arches next to it where there's more above it. And those Gothic arches provide more structural integrity. This one is, let's see here, I'm getting myself ahead of myself here. This one is on the north side, and this is a different window. And there's a picture of it from the outside. And again, there's not that much above it. So that allowed them to use a Roman arch without having some of the structural problems. And here we get a first look at the other architectural feature that I wanted to point out, which is those flying buttresses. Those are those kind of, I don't know what you call them, half arches that are supporting the sides of the building. So when we look at Gothic arches compared to the Roman arches, this gives you a little bit idea of how the forces work a little bit differently. So when you have that rounded Romanesque arch, the forces kind of go out at an angle to the sides. And so in order to make that work, you need to have really strong pillars, which is why Romanesque churches tend to have incredibly thick walls to be able to support all of the arches they used for the roof and for windows. With the Gothic arch, those forces are directed more down. Now, they're still lateral forces, but they're not as strong as they would be with the Romanesque arch. But they still need to deal with those lateral forces. And that's where the flying buttresses come in. So those are supporting the arches that are holding up the roof that are pushing out to the side. Those flying buttresses are supporting that. So there's a little bit of debate. For a long time, people kind of thought that Notre Dame was built without buttresses, started to crack, and then they used those buttresses to reinforce it after the fact. It seems like most of the scholars are saying, no, it was actually built with buttresses from the beginning. What is certain is that they have been rebuilt over time. So this is a drawing, I believe this is a fairly old drawing that shows what the buttresses would have looked like early on. So they used a series of arches to give it more support.
I have a question about the buttresses.
Yes.
So if you're going to go to all the trouble of putting up these buttresses, why not make your building that much bigger? What's the advantage of having them outdoors rather than indoors?
Well, you know, there was the theory that they put them up after the fact, like I was saying, and if you did it after the fact, there was no way to do it indoors. But like I say, now they're starting to think it was built in from the beginning. And I think the main reason for having them outside is just to unclutter the space on the inside.
Mm.
And, again, the forces from the roof, from the peak of the roof, are pushing out. And so you really do need them supporting the outside of the walls, because they'll fall outwards and collapse outwards.
I see. So in the absence of that wall that they're pushing against, they wouldn't be doing a job. They would be something different.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the walls that they're pushing against are the outside walls of the nave. And so, again, you have to think of their goals for what they were trying to do. They were trying to make it taller, and they were trying to create more windows to allow more light in.
Oh, so if the building extended as far as the buttresses, it wouldn't have that tall, thin look. It would be more of a squat building.
And that's the Romanesque style, where it was very squat, very thick walls. So yeah, absolutely, they needed to have these buttresses in order to get the height that they wanted, and then to allow the walls to be thinner. And by having the walls thinner, it made it easier to create these massive windows in it.
Paul?
Yes.
Was all this based on precise mathematics?
I think the short answer is yes, but that's outside of my pay grade. I know that throughout history, many cathedrals collapsed. So, what we're seeing are the results of the architects who were really good at their job. And, whether they did it by trial and error or precise mathematics, I think there's probably some who did the math route, some who did the trial and error part. But, it is not hard to find ruins in Europe of cathedrals where, they didn't get it right. They built too tall for the structure or what have you. So, they often messed it up.
I have some experience about that comes from watching people construct homes. If a carpenter or a framer is designing a roof, they don't usually sit down and do the trigonometry to figure out the triangular slope of the roof. There's actually a certain kind of tool that's sold for people making roofs that just does a certain rise over a certain run and marks it out on the tool. So the math is behind it, but the people doing it sometimes don't know the math behind it.
No, absolutely. And I think there definitely were people in both camps, those who knew what they were doing because they had the scientific knowledge to do it, well. And other people who just said, well, look at that. I bet you I can do that. And they tried to copy it, I think often we don't give people of the Middle Ages and earlier enough credit for how thoughtful and scientific they were often. But obviously not all of them had that background.
Yeah, this is an incredible work of engineering.
Yeah, it truly is. And this compared to let me see if I can go back. Whoops, I think, oh, there we go. So, you see this structure compared to one soaring half arch. They really upped their game over the years too, just in terms of how much, how many pillars and whatnot they needed to execute that. It's really remarkable.
Paul?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of curious. Have you seen any literature on scaffolding and stuff they use to actually do the construction?
A little bit. The stuff that I've seen is like really scary. I mean, it's basically wood beams that they just built on the spot ad hoc.
Yeah.
It's not like they bought something and rolled it in. These buildings are still the tallest buildings in the surrounding area. I mean, they're massive buildings by today's standards. And so, working without safety harnesses on ad hoc scaffolding, you know, that was not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. So here's a different view where you can see some of those flying buttresses on the end there. Just gorgeous.
Paul,
Yes.
one thing I wanted to mention talking about the scaffolding, if you've been to China, you see a whole different way. They build these tall buildings with bamboo scaffolding that's tied together.
Wow.
Well, it's scary to watch.
I was going to mention that, you know, I watched that in action, you know, and they don't use harnesses either. They're walking on
Oh,
bamboo.
yeah.
They're walking on bamboo up, you know, 20 stories high.
Unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
Wow. Well, I want to move to a different Gothic church, and this is one of my favorites. This is the Cologne Cathedral in Cologne, Germany. This is just a magnificent, magnificent building. One of the tallest around, 142 feet compared to, that's the inside floor to ceiling, 115 for Notre Dame. So, you know, quite a bit taller. It just feels massively enormous on the outside and enormous on the inside. If you look at the bottom right corner, you can see a little green arch building. That's the train station. And here's a view of it again. That's the train station on the left. I've spent about 4 years of my life living in Europe, much of that as a relatively poor student. I was a pretty good student, but I didn't have a lot of money. That's a better way to put it. But one thing that I always, you know, made sure I found enough money for was to get train passes when I had vacation or whatnot. And so I spent a lot of time on the trains, and Cologne is kind of a crossroads for a lot of train lines. Less so now with the fall of the wall, but when I was doing most of my traveling, it was pre-unification, and so I just wound up coming through Cologne an awful lot. And I love to be able to just get out of the train and literally walk across the street and just walk through this cathedral. Did that countless times. A view of the train tracks coming into the station with the cathedral in the background. So the cathedral was started in about 1248, but work on it halted in about 1560. So the cathedral remained unfinished for almost 300 years. This is actually a picture from 1856. This is what it looked like. And you see that crane on the kind of left side a little bit? That is a crane from the 15th century. So they had erected this crane and just left it there for 300 years. So why did they stop? Well, one of them is clearly money. I mean, I think the architects of this had a grander vision than maybe they had the stomach for to follow through. But there's another reason that you'll read, and I don't know how much of this is true, but it was taking so long to visit. I'm getting a lot of background noise. Let's see here. But anyway, it was taking a very long time to finish. And by the time, you know, after they were, you know, got as far as they got, the Gothic style was becoming passé. People had moved on. It wasn't the architectural style of the day. And actually, you know, they didn't call it Gothic back in the day. It was just, you know, the modern style. That was what they were building in. The word Gothic came out as kind of an insult. So, you know, around the time that they stopped construction on that, you know, they had moved on to, you know, Baroque architecture and all these other styles. And, you know, so people who were into the most modern styles would look down their nose at these types of churches and, ooh, that's Gothic, you know, so that was kind of used as a way to slam it. But it was obviously finished in the 1800s. Let's see here.
So the
we'll get to it
Gothic
in a
people
minute.
were, that's a tribe in Northern Europe, Gothic, the
Mm-hmm.
Visigoths and all those guys.
Yeah, I mean, the word is loaded in some ways that I'm not sure I completely understand, but it certainly was looked down upon for a very long period of time.
They were the barbarians, right?
Yeah, well, that's true, and I don't know if that contributed some of it. That probably is where the negative using of that word for architecture that wasn't in style came from. Is you know, they were basically saying that's barbarian architecture, maybe. I don't know. That's a good point. But
Paul,
anyway, yes.
so during the time that this was unfinished, between the 1500s and the 1800s, did it get used at all? I mean, was it used as a place of worship?
It did.
Okay.
They had finished most of the, I shouldn't say finished, they had a roof over most of it. So it was a viable structure. It just wasn't.
Because there are relics there that certainly didn't kind of show up in the 1800s.
Absolutely, yes. So no, it was a going concern. Now, some of those relics, we'll talk about a few of them in a second, but some of those were from other places that were brought in. But no, it was the cathedral. It did function. You know, like most cathedrals with a long history, it had moments where it was not used as a cathedral. Napoleon housed troops there, and you know, all kinds of things happened. But yeah, it was a viable building, even though it was, you know, far from the finished product. So one of the reasons that it finally did get rebuilt was, you know, this was a time in the, you know, 1860s, 1870s, kind of rising German nationalism. So, you know, Germany was still kind of divided and was just starting to form into what we think of as Germany. So Prussia had fairly recently taken over this area. And Prussia is largely Protestant, but the area around Cologne is largely Catholic. And so one of the reasons that they decided to finish this off, that the Prussians decided to finish this off, was as kind of a way to bring on the Catholics who lived in this area, to make them feel better about this. Hey, these Prussians aren't so bad. Look, they're helping build our cathedral. So a lot of the money was raised locally to finish it, but then the Prussian government also contributed a very substantial amount to finish this. So this is a picture from the war. The Cologne was one of the first major cities that you could get to by airplane from England. So they just bombed the living daylights out of the place. You may not be able to see a whole lot of detail there, but literally every single building is bombed out all around it. There's also a bombed out bridge in the background. So that's the River Rhine. There was nothing left. 14 bombs hit the cathedral, and they certainly did some damage, but it was left standing after the war. And a lot of people have questioned, why wasn't it destroyed? And one of the theories is that you know, it's such a large building that bombers used it as a navigation aid when they were going deeper into Germany. You know, they could see that as they're flying and course correct based on where they were from those steeples. So at least some people say that it was very intentionally not bombed, if for no other reason than so that the pilots could navigate. So there's a look of the inside. Pictures just don't do the scale justice. You really have to be inside there to get a sense of the scope of it. Just amazing. There's some flying buttresses. Now, since the cathedral was rebuilt in relatively modern times, They tried to follow the architectural plans, the original plans that were existent, but they use modern materials and construction techniques to a certain extent. So there is steel in this building, for example, something you generally don't find in medieval cathedrals. But it still looks amazing. Here's the largest surviving bell. They did actually have a larger one at one point that got melted down into cannons, but this was originally cast in 1418, recast in 1880. You can see a picture, if you see the guy below it, that gives you a little sense of the size there. So I want to pivot a little bit to art. Since we're in Cologne, I'll just stay there for a minute. We've talked about stained glass. Here's some of the stained glass. These are 3 separate that I just put on one slide. Just some of the amazing stained glass in Cologne. We talked about relics. This is the shrine of the 3 kings. So this is supposedly the body of the wise men. They did open this box at one point about 150 years ago, and they did indeed find 3 bodies in it. This box, well, first of all, the bodies, the story goes that they were situated in Constantinople, and they were brought to Milan to be cared for by Constantine, Emperor Constantine. And so they stood in a church in Milan for about 700-800 years. And then the Emperor Barbarossa took the contents of this box was later, but they took the bodies from Milan and gave them to the Archbishop of Cologne. So they've been there ever since in Cologne. And this was kind of the prime draw for the cathedral in Cologne. And it's one of the reasons why the original architecture plans for that cathedral were so grand. They kind of felt like this is one of the prime relics of Europe, therefore it needs a prime building to house it. So this box, if you can tell, it's basilica shaped. Now we kind of know what that means a little bit. And that alone, that was made in the 12th century. So it's just incredible. Here's a look at it from the end. It's the same box there. So that's, it's holds the relics, but it's an incredible work of art. This is a crucifix. This is a 10th century crucifix. By some measures, it's the oldest large crucifix that still exists. Some people put a qualifier north of the Alps, whatever, but it's very impressive, and it's very, very old and quite beautiful. This is a medieval statue of St. Christopher from 1470. That's stone. And this is really interesting to me because it has the colors on it. When you go to cathedrals, you'll see a lot of stonework, and almost always what you'll see is white. But generally speaking, they weren't originally white. What a lot of kind of 19th century people did was they whitewashed them as a way of preserving the stone. So unfortunately, because of that, even if we could recover the pigments, they're long gone. But here we have an example where you can see the pigments and get a sense of what it would have looked like in a contemporary way. And this is the Build Altarpiece. This is called a triptych. So it's in 3 panels. I love these types of altarpieces. You not only have the exquisite paintings there, but you also have the woodworking, the fine detail there. that kind of frames it. This type of altar is designed to close. So those two outside panels have hinges and then close into the center. And then there's usually decorations on the other side of it as well. This was created for a chapel that no longer exists in Cologne and was moved into the cathedral in 1810. So I'm going to stop there for a second. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I have a question it's about taking pictures in these cathedrals, because I've visited them, many of them, and I always feel reticent to take a picture because I feel like it's almost disrespectful.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I go into these buildings, I try to read the room. You know, some of these buildings you'll walk in and it is set up to be a place of worship at that moment. You'll see people in the pews praying. You'll see, you know, priests walking around and getting ready for something or doing whatnot. And, you know, in those cases where I feel like the vast majority of people are there to pray or to worship or what have you, I definitely do not take pictures. I try to stay in the back and be as quiet as I can. For better or for worse, many cathedrals spend much of their time being a tourist destination. It's, you know, chances are if you go to Cologne and walk into the cathedral, there will be 150 tourists there. And in cases like that, you know, I don't have that same type of feeling, and everybody pretty much expects you to take pictures. I do try to not use a flash because the flash tends to kind of bounce around in those types of buildings. It can be very disruptive. Yeah, it is one of those things where there is no right or wrong. You just kind of have to use your judgment. I think the Cologne Cathedral is charging an admission these days, so that gives you also a little bit of a feel. If you're paying to get in, I think, you know, they've kind of made that decision that at least for these hours during the day, it isn't, you know, a place of worship in the same sense as the corner chapel where people are actively praying. But your mileage may vary on that for sure. Other thoughts or questions before we kind of move on? All right, so I wanted to look around just at some of the other altarpieces and other works of art, just to kind of get a feel of what's out there. This is St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent. And look at that altarpiece. That's the Ghent Altarpiece, 1432 by Van Eyck. Just incredible, all the different panels there. And that's what it looks like closed. So here's an example of where when you close it, then they've decorated the outside of it as well. So a lot of these altarpieces are now in museums. There's still many in functioning churches and cathedrals. But fortunately, they've preserved a lot of the altarpieces from, you know, cathedrals and churches and chapels that have, you know, been destroyed or closed down or fell over or what have you. So if you go to some of the finer museums in Europe, you'll often see these altarpieces there as well. Sometimes they've been broken up and basically just displayed as individual paintings. When that has happened, it's kind of a shame because then you lose a lot of the woodwork around it. But it's certainly better than nothing. This is the Cathedral of Our Lady in Antwerp. And that's the raising of the cross. That's a Rubens. So one of the reasons I'm kind of pointing out some of these is, you know, they had like real artists who are known for their paintings. you know, hanging in art galleries do some of these altarpieces. So absolute masterpieces. This is also by Rubens in the same place, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. This was, oh, not a triptych, but one piece behind an altar. And yet another Rubens, the Descent from the Cross. All three Rubens in one church.
Mhm.
This is St. James Church in Rottenburg of the Tauber. This is, believe it or not, a Protestant church. This is actually one of the nicest Protestant churches, certainly in Germany, and some exceptional flying buttresses there, you'll notice. Of course, this wasn't built as a Protestant church, but they have kept it quite beautiful inside, escaping the fate of many of the other Protestant churches where a lot of the pieces like the altar that you see there were kind of stripped out. And there we get a closer view. This one is a carved altarpiece, which is really, really amazing. Trying to get a sense of time here. So we've got about 7 minutes. And this is also in the same church where you have kind of sculptures flanked by paintings. And this is a closable altarpiece. And I don't have nearly enough time to do this justice, but this is Charlottesville in France. Magnificent flying buttresses there. A lot of common architectural features to the Louvre. More kind of Gothic style towers there. One of the things I wanted to just point out, I could go for hours on Charlottesville, but I really like the stonework, the stone sculptures there. Angel of Chartres, the sundial there. This is next to one, or kind of over one of the doorways. Those are monsters and devils tempting Christians. And that's a choir screen on the inside. All stonework, stone carved. And from there, I'm going to warp very briefly to Algoma, Wisconsin. If you look at, see the little lions there, kind of under the peaks. Those are stone, and those were carved by my great grandfather, Simeon Navarre. So I come from a long line of stone carvers. Unfortunately, my father was the last of the line. But my father and my grandfather, they cut stone for buildings. So we used to drive around Milwaukee, and my dad would point at all the houses where he cut and delivered stone for the building of those houses. But when you go further back in my history, we have people who did actual decorative stonework from the Basque region in France, and then eventually into the United States. So stonework has a special place for me. And then I just wanted to take a look real quick at St. Peter's to kind of wrap up a little bit. Of course, this is Vatican City, Rome. And probably the most famous stonework in a church, Michelangelo's Pieta. This is so impressive. What amazes me is how you can take stone and make flowing cloth out of it. Look at the cloth underneath Jesus there. It just feels like it has movement. And that was carved out of stone. It's unbelievable. St. Peter's itself is an incredible work of art. Just every inch of it is absolutely amazing. I do have kind of a funny feel in there because it feels a little bit like our Capitol building. It's kind of that same just overpowering sense of stone and granite and all of that type of thing. But it is truly impressive. And then this building, that is the Sistine Chapel. You almost never see what the Sistine Chapel looks like because of the way it's built. It's surrounded by the buildings. You can never see it from the outside. The only way it's possible is to kind of get above it and take a picture down of it. And it doesn't look all that impressive from the outside, but then you get inside.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely amazing. So, you know, we think of Michelangelo with the Sistine Chapel, but he wasn't the only artist who contributed to the Sistine Chapel. This is Botticelli, Trials of Moses. Raphael designed tapestries for the Sistine Chapel. I think most of those are in England. I think some of them are in Rome, but they're usually not on display. But, you know, they weren't afraid of hiring the best. This is delivery of the keys by Perugino. You know, and these are just on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. And then, of course, we get to the Last Judgment by Michelangelo. And the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And the creation of Adam. So these are frescoes. So a fresco is where they have kind of wet plaster and then they mix pigments with water and kind of put it into the plaster. And when it dries, it becomes an integral part of the structure of the ceiling or the wall that they're working on. So it's not like he just went in there with a paintbrush and painted. It was a much more intensive process. And I think we are about a minute away from wrapping up, so I am going to stop there for any questions, comments. If not, we have one more session next week, so I hope you'll be able to join me as we wrap up on next Sunday.
Thank you, Paul. This is
Thanks, Paul.
fascinating.
It
Thank
is.
you so much. I'll hang out for just another minute or two if anybody has any other thoughts or questions. But
Oh, what's the size of the Sistine Chapel? Is it 39 feet wide?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say that's probably pretty close. I don't have the dimensions with me, but it's not nearly as long as some of the other buildings. But it's also not very tall, and I don't know if there's no windows or very few windows in there. I suppose we can go back and.
According to Google,
Yeah, so there's windows at the top.
According to Google, the Sistine Chapel ceiling is 133 feet long and 46 feet wide.
There we go. Yeah.
But I don't know how tall it is.
Paul,
Yes.
the gargoyles that your father made for the church that you showed us just now, are those working gargoyles? Does the water come out their mouths?
You know what? I have never actually been there in person.
Okay.
And I think they do, but I'm not 100% sure. It looks like they do.
It does. Yeah, it does.
One little bit of trivia: we think of gargoyles and Notre Dame, right? They have those.
Function.
Those were added very late. Those are like 19th century. So Victor Hugo kind of, promoted Notre Dame, and there became a real interest in you know, turning it back into a wonderful place, because it had really gone downhill. Napoleon had basically closed it and then used it as a barracks, and it had really been abused. And so the gargoyles are a function of the 19th century rebuilding of it.
Paul, many of these cathedrals also have treasuries that have things, you know, the chalice and all of those kind of things. You going to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I have a little bit. When I talk about relics, that's
great.
what we're talking about. So many of the large cathedrals that get a lot of tourists have like a separate museum.
Right.
Very often they'll charge a little admission, and they'll have their most valuable pieces in that little museum, and that will include relics, and they'll include, you know, some works of art and whatnot that they don't want to have just out, you know, that people can touch or damage.
Well, and I notice is things like the chalice and those kind of things that we see in everyday worship, but are just not like what we see in everyday worship.
I was kind of misunderstanding. I was thinking of like a relic, you know. I think a few people have claimed the Holy Grail type stuff. But yeah, no, absolutely. The very often those are kept in those museums because they are very valuable, and sometimes they use them on high days and state occasions. But very often they don't. They just have a utilitarian one that they, you know, use for mass on a normal basis, and they have the golden, you know, fancy one from the 14th century that they keep in the museum, or, you know, otherwise locked away. Yeah, I don't know if I'll get too much more into that area, but it is interesting for sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.